So without further delay, I would like to introduce our speakers. Luisa Bonin is a social impact practitioner and researcher. She holds a social communications degree with a focus on public relations. Her project on strategic philanthropy was selected for the German Chancellor Fellowship for Prospective Leaders. This is a program of Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. She was hosted by Mecenata Foundation as a research fellow in 2022. Luisa has over 10 years of experience leading projects to support low-income micro-entrepreneurs in Brussels and Portugal. It has been a real pleasure to collaborate with you, Luisa. Britt Lake, as I mentioned, is the CEO of Feedback Labs, where she leads a team working to change the norms in development aid and philanthropic policy to be more responsive to the people these policies aim to help. And before this role, she was a member of the executive team at Global Giving. And this is, as you know, the world's first and largest global crowdfunding community. Britt has also worked at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with a variety of nonprofits throughout sub-Saharan Africa. It's great to have you with us, Britt. So, this is an event about listening practices. So to kick the meeting off, we have a question for you. It's a very quick question. So I'm launching the poll here. I will just read the question and the responses, and we give you 1 minute to think and respond. How would you describe your organization's listening practices? Would you say, I don't know what you mean by listening, or we like the idea of listening to our grantees and constituents, but haven't started yet, or we do a good listening to input and feedback, but we don't do much with it later after that, or we think we do a good job listening and acting on feedback, but it's not systematic, or finally, we do a great job systematically listening, acting on feedback, and reporting back to our grantees and constituents. So please take your time, listen, think a little bit, and then make your choice. Okay, I will stop here. Not more responses are coming. So we received responses from 31 participants so far, 67 of the participants. So the result is that many of you, 68% of you, think that you do a good job listening and acting on feedback. Only 10% thinks that they do a great job. So it means that there's some space for improvement. And we also have 3% saying, I don't know what you mean by listening. So this, you are at the right place. You will hear about this. So let's end the poll. So Luisa, how are these findings similar to what you found in your study?
Thanks, Evda, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for the participation in this poll. And I think it's pretty much aligned, actually, because you will see that we have lots of organizations doing feedback, but not doing that in a systematic way, in a formal way, and same stuff with the reporting back process. Some of them already have some practice, but there is still a huge space for formalize the reporting back practices and to see how other foundations are doing that. Yeah.
Okay, that's already very interesting. So we can't wait to hear other learnings from your study. So please tell us how foundations listen.
Okay, let's go. So I will be sharing my screen. One moment. And here we go. I think everyone is seeing, right? And if there's some technicality, please let me know. Okay, again, I want to thanks to Sevda, to Dan, to all the philea team for having believed in this partnership since the beginning. Thanks again, thanks again also Brit and Alexis from Feedback Labs for inviting this, accepting this invitation. I'm super happy to have you here. And again, to my host foundation, Masenata Foundation, my mentor, Dr. Rupert Strachwitz, and of course to the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation that allowed that this research happened and supported my research journey in Germany. Well, the research goal that I had was to understand how foundations listen and how the voices of the grantees and the people that they supported somehow, how those voices were taken into account to make decisions. So basically that was the goal. And then my research base, when I started, I looked through existing frameworks on listening. So I go to the constituent voice methodology from Keystone Accountability and feedback methodology from Feedback Labs that you are going to listen a little bit about, and a publication from the US consulting firm Equita Consulting. So it's a publication called Bridging the Gap, a review of foundations and listening practices. So my research and my interviews is pretty much built upon on what they always also are studying back in the US. And yes, and then I will talk a little bit about the terminology. So you will see that during the report, I refer to primary constituents as opposed to beneficiaries. And that is the same term that is used by feedback methodology, taking into account the importance of agency and voice that somehow can be suppressed to those when we refer to those at the heart of the philanthropic effort as beneficiaries. I'm also use grantees a lot, so it's the NGOs mostly receiving the funds and operating the social projects. I also use foundations a lot, the concept of feedback and the concept of report back. By reporting back, what I mean to that is when the organizations, they share the decisions that were made after the listening process with the people, with the ones that provided their input, such as grantees, the primary constituents, and the other stakeholders. And for the concept of feedback, I will invite Brit to talk a little bit about it. So I will stop sharing and Brit will start.
Wonderful. I'm going to share my screen now as well. Thank you so much to the team for having me here. Here we go. In terms of feedback, can everyone see my screen okay? Great. When we talk about feedback, again, we're referring to the thoughts, the feelings, the perceptions from people at the heart of our work about our products or services and their impact. And feedback is used to influence related activities in the future. At Feedback Labs, we generally expand our definition to talk about listening as well. So listening and acting on feedback, which allows us to be a little bit broader and hear about ideas, challenges, or solutions that may not be directly related to an activity that we've already carried out. Again, it's called the feedback loop because it's meant to be cyclical and carried out before, during, and after a program or project. There are really three purposes. And again, this is just to ground us all in a shared understanding before we hear the research. So feedback can identify the most effective solutions to the needs of people at the heart of your work. It can strengthen outcomes. It can save valuable time and money. It can help you identify whose needs aren't being met and emphasize diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'll go through just very quickly the full stages of the feedback loop again, so that we're all approaching this research with a shared understanding. So you'll see here the full feedback loop. A high quality feedback practice includes all of these stages in order to close the loop. The first thing that we talk about is buy-in. And again, that is not a specific step, but it's something that happens continuously throughout the process. So you're working to build trust with all of the stakeholders that are part of a project. So that means buy-in from constituents, and that creates an environment that's safe for feedback. Buy-in from staff allows you to cultivate trust, particularly, again, from those frontline staff who could be threatened by the idea of feedback. And then buy-in from senior leadership, that actually allows you to translate that feedback into actionable change and lends legitimacy to the process. Getting into the specific steps, first we talk about the design stage. That's when you identify the what, the who, the how of the feedback process. What's the key topic, the issue or program that you want to get feedback about? Who's your target audience? And given that, what factors do you need to consider to allow them to give you feedback? And then given that context, how is the best way to reach them? The next stage is the collect phase. This is when we talk about the need to determine a collection method. So are we going to use surveys, focus groups, interviews, other creative methods like voting with marbles, and we decide on the feedback and demographic questions we'd like to ask to generate actionable insights. The next stage we talk about is the analyze stage. This is where we make sense of the feedback data that we've received by disaggregating or segmenting the responses. We might also benchmark those responses, and that allows us to compare results with other programs or organizations. The dialogue phase comes next. This is where we discuss what we found in the collect phase. We dig deeper by verifying, clarifying, and refining our understanding of their feedback, and we co-create the solutions together. So dialogue is really a two-way conversation that both solicits answers and raises expectations about course correction, which is our final stage here. This is where we're able to make changes in response to the feedback you received. So you collect feedback, you listen to it, you dialogue about it, and then finally you make changes based on those findings that you have. And with that, I will pass it back to Luisa to share what came out of the research that you did.
Thank you so much, Britt, for this explanation and presenting the feedback to us. Just one moment while I go back to sharing my screen. Okay, so that we did already this and this. Okay, everyone is seeing? All good? Nice. So a little bit about the methodology. This project is based on qualitative research. So it's focused on European foundations. And the concept behind the sample was to gather different listening practices and analyze different points of view. So I've sent 30 interview invitations, 13 were conducted, and the results in the research, they are shown as percentage. So when you see the report, you will see the percentage to make it easier to read, but they are not representative of the sector, okay? And then a little bit about the participant foundations. From the 13 participants, 11 disclosed their annual budget, and those that disclose, we have a combined annual budget of 1.3 billion euros. Most of these foundations are in Germany, and then we have Switzerland, Netherlands, and Austria. We are talking about 69% being private foundations, 46% have a mix of proprietary projects and grant making, 38% just grant making, and most of them has a regional, a national, and an international approach to their grant making or to their proprietary projects at the same time. And then we are going to start to talk about the results. Okay, so why and who is the most listened to? We understood that foundations, they listen to improve the relationship with the grantees and to improve their impact. and the foundation's most listened to grantees, stakeholders, sorry, are the grantees and the primary constituents. When we are talking about when and how to listen, the listening practices of the organizations, they were more concentrated at the strategy formulation and in the evaluation phases within a project lifecycle. And this was interesting because lots of foundations say they have like a relationship approach, a relationship-based grant making, but they actually have few listening parts at the implementation of the project. And then the two most common methods used by foundations to listen were site visits and regular meetings with grantees. And then in total, all the foundations, they mentioned together 29 different methods to listen, but on average, the organizations use 5 different methods. So there are also a huge space to test other approaches to listening. And then when we are talking about feedback and reporting back, we saw that the majority of foundations, they have a formal process in place to receive feedback. But when we are talking about the reporting back phase in the listening process, this phase is mostly not institutionalized or non-existent. So, and what I mean by that, there is no clear mechanism in place for sharing the results or the outcomes of the listening process with the stakeholders that provided their voice, such as the grantees and primary constituents. And also an important thing to talk about on the reporting back phase is that in the feedback methodology, the constituent voice methodology, the reporting back is not just when you are able to change something, but it's also meant when you are not able to change something, you also report back and say, okay, this is I can change this is my limitations, but this process also builds trust with grantees and primary constituents. And then when we talk about power imbalance and actions to mitigate power imbalance, most of the foundations, they say that they have an open discussion about power imbalances between the staff. Some organizations have also shared that when they level up this conversation about power imbalance to the board, it becomes a little bit hard to have an open conversation, but all foundations, they say that they take actions to reduce power imbalance when they are working with the grantees. And the most common methods that they use includes developing long-term relationships with grantees, offering non-financial support, and also simplifying the reporting process. Then I also asked the foundations what they think that are the most pressing skills to the listening process. So when it comes to the skills that foundations, they consider essential for listening, the most popular ones were self-awareness and growth mindset. In the beginning, I thought it was a little bit different from what I was expecting. I was expecting to hear communication skills, but actually self-knowledge skills was nice to hear and a good insight. And also, I forgot to mention, but who I interview in the staff of the foundations, they are mostly CEOs or grants manager or learning managers. So they are people that are involved with the grant management process. And then when I ask the organizations about the challenges in the listening process, I receive like lots of different types of challenges. And they were a little bit hard to congregate together. So I decided that I needed to use levels of challenges. And I decided to use the cultural iceberg model to try to separate them within levels. So I separate the challenges into the level 1, so the most superficial, that we are talking about artifacts, we are talking about behaviors, challenges that are more easy to see and also more easy to tackle, more easy to change. And then we go to the levels 2, it's deep, it's a little bit hard to see, We are talking about rules, policies, and process. And then to the deepest level, which is the level 3, we are talking about beliefs, values. Sometimes it's super hard to see, hard to tackle, and hard to change. You will be able to see a more explanation of all the challenges, but here is a little bit of the summary of them. So in the level 1, we have time restrictions, we have staff recruiting problems, geographic reach. And then when we go to the second level, we are talking about transparency, about reporting process that are overburdening. We are talking about the relationship of the grantees, but also with the non-grantees. The challenge of hearing negative feedback, for example. We are talking about listening process among the staff, and also about transforming listening into learning. And the deepest level is, we are talking about lack of a more transparent and participatory culture. We are talking about patriarchy, Eurocentricity, the need and the belief of control. We are talking about competition within the philanthropic sector, about centralized power within the organization, and a lack of an internal listening practices. So those are a myriad of challenges that the listening process is influenced by. And then you will see then in the report that I decided, as also the Ecotech Consulting Research used the participation spectrum from the International Association for Public Participation in order to classify the interview organizations into those levels of participation. So the levels goes from inform to empower and has an increasing impact in the decision. And in order to adapt this framework for the context of this qualitative research, I consider grantees and primary constituents as the public. And I also consider the reporting back phase on the promise to the public there into the consult level, to that highlighted part there that says, we will keep you informed, listen and acknowledge concerns and acknowledge concerns and aspirations, and provide feedback on how public input influenced the decision. So I'm considering this, the reporting back process, and when I classify the organizations, I included in the consulting level just ones that have the reporting back process formally in place. And then when we are talking about the results of how they fall into those levels, 53% of the interview foundations, so half of them, they have listening practices that correspond to the informed level. And that is due to the fact that there is no formal process to report back on the decisions that they made after the listening practice. So they don't provide any feedback on how the input influenced the decision. Then we have 31% of the foundations interviewed on the consult level. And this is mainly because of the reporting back process. So they have a formal process of reporting back. And here I will just put some of the examples of reporting back that they mentioned. So for example, sharing grantee perception reports, learnings and course correction with the respondents being grantees or primary constituents, when they have a fixed place inside the monitor, evaluation and learning process, where the foundation and the grantee, they discuss together the results of monitoring and evaluation, and this process is formalized into their learning process and automatically informs the new strategy. The ones they also share internal strategy and the decisions that they made in events with grantees, with primary constituents, and they also share the evaluation reports. And I also include in this level organizations that, even if they did not have a formal reporting back process in place, they have they include grantees or primary constituents into their decision-making body. So in the board of the foundation, for example, so they have a voice, and they understand directly about the reporting back, and they can also be part of the decision, and they also publicize that their strategic choice annually. We have then just one foundation that falls into the involved level, and you will see that the practices, they are starting to add one to another. So to be on the involved level, they have a reporting process, back process in place, and the foundation also takes several actions to mitigate power imbalance between the staff and the grantees, such as offering whistleblower lines. They simplify reporting processes. They are an agile organization with flat hierarchy. They have a code of conduct with the grantees. They build long-term relationships with the grantees. They support grantees to listen to primary constituents directly. And they also have this, they reported to us to have a culture of sharing and learning from failures, from their own failures, from the foundation failures with the grantees directly. And then we have one foundation that falls into the in-power level, and this is the case of participatory grant making. So it's a direct decision. And then some of the key recommendations to improve listening process and practices, you will see that are more into the report, but I just made a summary here. So the reporting back, you will see, you saw that is an essential piece if you're of the listening practice, if the foundations wants to be more than only informative. And the report mentioned a myriad of examples of reporting back tools that can be tested by foundations. Then we have organizations with more actions to mitigate power imbalance, that they tend to be more participative in the spectrum of participation. So a reflection that can be done here is there enough space, internal space, to the staff to exchange and learn how power imbalance operates in their daily activities, how those learnings about power imbalance mitigation actions, they turn into practices, they turn into processes. Another recommendation is about being an agile, a flexible organization, horizontal hierarchies. They create better environment for listening practices, because organizations, they need to be flexible to listen. Otherwise, of course, listening doesn't inform any decision making. Another insight here is that most of the organizations that they report that they listen directly to the primary constituent and indirectly from through the grantee. But most of them that are listening directly from the primary constituent, sorry, they say that they use site visits, and this site visits is usually mediated by the grantee. So one thing is acknowledge that sporadic site visits are insufficient to develop a relationship, and instead of doing that, invest in other ways to support the grantees' listening techniques. And then the final key recommendation here that I decided to include is that the intensity and the quality of the listening can vary inside the same organization, because we are talking about different projects, different national, regional, international reaches, and also depends on the individual that is responsible for the relationship. So offer internal staff training as a group or towards the listening process, in addition to coaching individuals, can also help to develop better listening practices. Okay, so that was it. Let me see here. I will then invite Britt to comment and to talk a little bit about the feedback and the learnings that the Feedback Labs has to share.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate, going to share my screen now. There we go. All right. Really appreciate the this research adding to the body of research around how foundations are listening and acting on feedback, particularly in the European context. Just as a quick overview, we said at the beginning, Feedback Labs, we are a nonprofit working to build the feedback field. We want feedback and listening to be the norm, and we work with foundations and nonprofits to help them listen and act on feedback in high quality and equitable ways. And so this body of research really helps us understand where the field is now, so we can understand where we need to go and how. Everything that sort of was in Luisa's report, we see reflected both anecdotally and in research we've done in the US context around foundations. So this really resonated with us. I wanted to spend some time a little bit future looking. So we just spent some time thinking and hearing about what foundations are doing now to listen and act on feedback. And so a common question that we get is, as a funder, how can I better support listening and acting on feedback in my foundation and among my grantees? For this, I'm going to pull from a resource that one of our partners has put together, a funder action menu. Fund for Shared Insight is a funder collaborative in the US that is looking at funding and doing research in the feedback field. So I'm going to highlight 8 ways to listen better, that foundations can do that here. This, ties back, Luisa said, she talked about the 26 different listening practices, I believe, that came up in her study. And on average, foundations do like 5 of them. So I'm going to talk about 8 different ways to listen. And as we think about that, it'll help us understand different ways you can sort of mix and match some of these things. So one way is talking about feedback in the application and reporting process. So I have an example here. This sends the message that philanthropy cares about feedback, that listening to people and communities is the expectation. So here's an example from the Moses Taylor Foundation, a question that they include in their application process. How do you solicit feedback from your participants? Do you have a system in place to make changes to your programs based on the feedback received? Again, sending the message to their grantees that this is something that they care about. The second way is convening nonprofits and funders to listen and learn together. So an example here is the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. They invited nonprofit partners that are part of its portfolio on student, family, and community voice to a virtual convening that they co-designed and the grantees led themselves. And they brought the funders across their education team as well as their grantees, and they shared strategies across. So building this practice of feedback and listening is a journey. It should be done collectively with funders and nonprofits, really being in it together, sharing learnings, experiences, data, and good practice can be a great way to listen and learn to your grantees. The third one I'll just go over here is making capacity building grants to improve nonprofit listening practice. So listening and collecting feedback, like all work that we do, isn't free. If you're encouraging grantees to listen, you should support that with funding to help them understand to listen well. So Luisa talked in her recommendations about training, the importance of training for staff as well as grantees. And these are grants that could be in support of that training. It could be staff time to collect and analyze feedback, or even additional funds to allow organizations to pivot if they're receiving feedback about things that need to be altered mid-project. An example here is NEPA Funders Collaborative. They set aside $90,000 to support 5 different nonprofits to collect feedback through Listen for Good, which is a tool that allows nonprofits to collect, analyze, and have actionable results from their feedback. They raised above those $90,000, and all of those funds around above that went to mini grants to help pay for changes the nonprofits made as a result of the feedback that they got. A fourth is using listening and feedback to inform your grant making directly. So funders can listen to and learn from their grantees' feedback efforts and help the funder themselves to make better informed and more equitable grant making decisions. An example of this comes from Reddif. After seeing feedback from one of its grantees about the need for behavioral health interventions, Reddif not only supported that specific grantee to make that change, but they realized that was something that was needed across similar organizations. So they supported similar approaches in their grant making at 6 of their other nonprofits. Fifth, using listening and feedback to inform your strategy development. So listening to grantees or directly to communities at the heart of your work can help inform strategy decisions. What challenges are communities identifying that the foundation isn't already addressing? Are there local organizations that communities speak highly of that aren't being supported by the foundation? Are there new ideas for addressing challenges that come up in these conversations? An example of this in practice is the Brooklyn Community Foundation. So they were launching a $10 million new $10 million portfolio around elder care in the Brooklyn community, their Brooklyn Elders Fund. To create that strategy, they had roundtables with experts from the elder care sector, but they also had, I think, 15 different conversations with 150 older adults from that community to help inform that strategy together. A sixth way is using listening and feedback to inform your measurement, learning, and evaluation. So not being exclusive to your grant making, but thinking about your learning, your measurement. Luisa mentioned she talked to several of the learning folks within the foundations that she talked to. By combining this qualitative feedback with quantitative data, funders can get a more complete picture of the success or challenges of a project. Additionally, research that's coming, new research is showing that it may even be possible to begin to predict the success of a project based on early feedback or by involving participants in the evaluation of the project. An example here, this comes from the nonprofit sector, but the PACE Center for Girls in the Southeast United States works with girls in their program to actually identify what questions even to ask to measure the success of their program. And they find that helps them understand what do the communities they serve, what do they see as success of the project. It helps them get feedback on what makes sense for them to measure. Seventh, listening directly to people and communities. So much of the funding, the listening that funders carry out is through their grantees. But things like listening tours, where funders listen directly to people and communities, can be really valuable to help foundations better serve the communities at the heart of their work, particularly in the strategic planning phase. An example here comes from the James Irvine Foundation. Several years ago, they changed their focus to support low-income workers in California. So rather than saying, we're going to sit back and go internal and hire consultants to think about what this looks like, they actually held listening sessions that reached 400 different residents across the state in 10 different languages. They brought members of their staff, their board, and that sort of experience continues to inform not only the strategy development, but the grant making going forward. And then finally, incorporating listening into other areas of foundation operations. So we talked about incorporating feedback and listening and grant making, but there are areas beyond that where foundations can bring feedback practices into their work. So some of those examples include hiring people with lived experience directly onto your staff, or prioritizing that lived experience when bringing on new board members, how you think about where you hold your meetings, and what those spaces look like. An example here comes from the Conrad and Hilton Foundation. They piloted an internship program for young people who have experience in the foster care system, and similarly are developing fellowship programs for people with lived experience in other issue areas where they work. So again, as you think about different ways to plug in, it might be one of these, it might be 8, you might go for the average that Luisa talked about of 5, but there are different ways that you can sort of think about improving your foundation's listening practices. There are resources out there from feedback labs and elsewhere that can help foundations do that. So a couple examples on here, and maybe we can put this, we'll put the links in the chat in just a moment. Feedback Labs runs a feedback incentive learning group. That's a membership group of funders who come together to think about research, to hear from experts, to work out their challenges together, to move the field forward. This funder action menu I just talked about, again, we'll put the link in the chat, and you'll be able to sort of see even more examples than the ones that I gave. Feedback Labs runs a crash course and other training, again, going back to those recommendations. How do you strengthen the capacity of your team to do that? We have a Center for Effective Philanthropy, a blog series of how feedback can strengthen philanthropy. And then finally, on the feedbacklabs.org website, we have a number of funder resources to tap into. So I'm going to pause there. I can see there's lots of questions in the chat. Although I haven't seen them yet, I'm going to stop sharing and then pass it back to the philea team.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Luisa, for sharing all these interesting findings from your study.